Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. Just because the floodwaters are gone doesn't mean the flood is over. For reporters in Texas, Louisiana, and now South Florida, that's one thing that will become apparent in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. In New Orleans, the recovery from Hurricane Katrina is still ongoing, 12 years after the storm. In New Jersey, cleanup after Superstorm Sandy is still ongoing, 5 years later. How to get a handle on that coverage? We have 3 journalists who have done so with us today. The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world. I'm Chris Adams, Director of Training at the National Press Foundation. The topic today, hurricanes and floods, how to cover them during the storm, but mostly how to cover them afterwards, once the waters recede, when the cleanup begins and the political battles do as well. We have 3 journalists with us today who have covered storms and the aftermath of them going back to Hurricane David in 1979, continuing through Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Superstorm Sandy in 2012, and the Baton Rouge floods of 2016. Joining me today are Wendy Benjaminson of USA Today, Jonathan Salant of the Star-Ledger of New Jersey, and Bryn Stoll of the Advocate in South Louisiana. We'll be talking about their experiences covering the storms and their tips for how reporters can do so. We'll also be taking questions from viewers. Tweet them at NatPress or submit via Facebook. So welcome. So we're going to talk about some of the storms that you guys have covered over the years. And over the years, as I mentioned, you've been involved with some of the big storms in U.S. history, from Hurricane David in 1989 to Katrina in 2005, the Baton Rouge floods just last year. And we're talking as Hurricane Irma is set to be one of the most destructive storms in U.S. history, or at least that's what it looks like right now. The latest probability map has it hitting South Florida on Sunday. And so what we're talking about today becomes extremely relevant for all the reporters in South Florida and those that are heading down to South Florida to start writing about the storm and the recovery from the storm. So I was hoping the 3 of you could just tell me a little bit about your personal experiences covering storms. Tell us, what you've covered and when you've covered, and kind of how the cleanup, how long the cleanup and recovery took place. Jonathan, I thought we could start with you. Jonathan Salant of New Jersey Advanced Media and Star-Ledger out of Newark. What was your experience covering the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy? And that's something that took place 5 years ago, right?
Well, the first storm I covered was actually Hurricane David in 1979 at the Miami Herald. And you could see how unpredictable hurricanes were. We had the entire newsroom. Newsrooms were big in those days, all over the flood, all over South Florida, and all ready for this big storm. Then at the last minute, it veered and hit much north, and Miami and that area was spared. On Hurricane Sandy, since I came down to Washington for the Star-Ledger in 2014, it's been a major part of my beat. That began 2 years after the storm. They're still looking for federal funds. There's still audits. There's still discussions about reimbursing of people who still have not been reimbursed from the damages they had in the storm.
Okay, so we're going to talk about some of those specific tips on how you track the money, which becomes a huge part of the aftermath in the storm. We'll come back to a little bit later. But Bryn, could you tell us a little bit about your hurricane coverage, or your flood coverage, I guess, and then your transition from boots on the ground reporter down in South Louisiana to DC reporter?
So the 2016 Baton Rouge floods were the first major flooding that I've covered in my career, and that kind of it hit us to some degree out of nowhere. I mean, we'd had some forecasting that there was a heavy rain front moving through, but then what happened is the front sort of just stalled over Baton Rouge, and in certain parts of the area got over 30 inches of rain within 24 hours, which felt like a huge amount of rain until we saw the rain totals piling up over in Houston and Harvey, and then covering the water. It took about 4 days for the water to really fully move through the area. And then, I felt like it was a real rush of adrenaline covering the flood and then pouring out there to get stories of people mucking out their homes. And then it's incredible just how long the recovery drags on. I mean, we're still looking at people. I was just out doing some anniversary stories earlier in August, and there's still people who are gutting their homes for the first time in the Baton Rouge area, and we're talking a year later now. And as you said, we're 5 years on, other areas are still recovering.
So it was August of 16.
August of 2016, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And Wendy, tell us about your hurricane history.
Well, mine goes back to Tropical Storm Allison in 2001, where Houston got something like 24 or 35 inches of rain, and Houston felt the legacy of the lack of recovery from that just recently with Hurricane Harvey, which, as Bryn noted, dumped 50 inches of rain in the Houston area. And the drainage systems that the city and county spent a fortune trying to improve after Tropical Storm Allison didn't work. And should have worked a little bit better than this. So the legacy of those old storms is still continuing today. Then the human cost of these stories is always what's so moving, because Hurricane Katrina, of course, created this huge diaspora of people all across the country, and many of them came to Houston. So I covered both Katrina in Louisiana and then the refugee crisis in Houston.
Okay.
And it was good to see.
Okay, and then also you covered Ike. Was that in?
Covered Ike and Rita.
Ike and
Yes.
Rita. So those were, so Katrina was in 05, and Rita was soon after that, also in 05.
Just a couple of months more, and that's where some important evacuation lessons were learned, because even though the storm hit fairly relatively unpopulated areas of Texas, it spared Houston, but the entire city of Houston were stuck on freeways getting out of town, and a bus caught on fire, people died. 100 people died in a storm that didn't hit Houston because of a botched evacuation order. This time, Mayor Turner kept people in Houston for Harvey, and even though their houses were flooded and it was awful, relatively few people died.
Okay, so we're going to talk about specific tips for how to cover the storms and the aftermath of storms. And I want to point our viewers to a great column or memo from Marty Mercer of the Miami Herald, who I guess you would have worked with way back
Yes.
in the Hurricane David years. So he was an editor and kind of legendary for his hurricane coverage and oversight of that coverage at the Miami Herald for years. You can find all of these tips at the Poynter Institute site. It's called Bring Pencils and 49 Other Things Hurricane Pros Know. A couple of the, he starts saying, don't get overly stressed, but then he reminds people, don't take unnecessary chances and don't get hurt. And he goes through a long list of practical tips that our viewers can look at. Don't bring your own car, rent one and keep an eye on it. Carry cash, bring food and water and sunscreen and pencils, and a bunch of other things. So Wendy, I was hoping you oversaw your reporters covering these storms. Tell me, why pencils? And what are the other tips that you kind of would pass on to your reporters?
Pencils are for a very practical reason. Pens don't work in the rain. Your phone isn't going to work in the rain. Your laptop's not going to work in the rain and the wind. So pencils are the good old-fashioned reporter tool that will never fail you. Waterproof pencils kind of work, kind of don't. Just get a number 2 and take it with you.
And I guess bring a sharpener with you also.
Bring a sharpener with you also,
Yes.
and a manual one, the good old-fashioned kind. The other thing to remember is just that you are going into a swamp of germs. You get the sense that walking through these floodwaters is like crossing a river with a current. It's not. It is every gift your dog has left all over the neighborhood. It is fire ants. It is poisonous snakes in the Gulf region, I'm sure. I don't know about Superstorm Sandy, but in the Gulf region, there are fire ants, there are snakes. The roaches that were in the walls are swimming around in the water. The sewage is in the water. Every germ you can possibly imagine is in this water. And so waders, high boots, no matter how hot it is, a hat, long sleeves, long pants, keep yourself covered, and bring snake bite kits, antibiotic cream, sunblock, bug spray. I mean, you are not going into it's almost like a combat zone against germs.
So I guess particularly for the reporters going out there and reporters who haven't experienced them, what sort of marching orders do you give them before you send them out?
Pretty much what we just said.
Yeah.
I remember an experience where someone came down from not a Gulf Coast reporter who came down to help us and scoffed at my maternal attempts to get him to protect himself against the sun and the bugs, and came back in a world of hurt and just told me how right I was. So, with welts all over him and second-degree sunburn and things like that. It's a mess out there. So you do have to be prepared. And reporters in hurricane season and a lot of reporters I know, we have all these go kits in our office that you keep with you that have all these things in it, some protein bars, a bottle of water. And getting cash is a really important thing to do because the ATMs won't work and the banks aren't open. So, get your company to give you as much cash as possible before you head out.
Okay. So I want to share a couple of other tips from Marty Mercer's column. An all-purpose caution: don't be an idiot. If you are hurt or dead, we can't get your stuff online or in the paper. Yeah. And finally, he's looking after his reporters here. Don't stand in standing water. Let the other idiots get electrocuted. We don't need them anyway. We can't replace because we're in a hiring freeze, which I guess is the case for news organizations everywhere. Always in a hiring freeze, so don't get electrocuted.
Yeah.
So Bryn, I was hoping you could maybe tell me, you were on the ground most recently for the floods last year, which, as you said, it's a different circumstance than the hurricane. But what sort of kind of on the ground tips did you develop for getting around, for how to actually go about and do your job of reporting, and then transmitting your information back?
I think I learned had some success, and I think I learned a lot of things not to do. I was caught, I think, relatively unprepared. I mean, we're a South Louisiana news organization. We have a hurricane plan. We have hurricane kits and all that. But this was not a hurricane. There was no, long advisory from the moment. It was just a tropical depression moving all across the Atlantic, and you could track it. It was a rainstorm that I was totally unprepared for. So the way I ended up covering it, I was off on Saturday, and I got a call from my editor early that morning and said, "Can you go out to a news conference in one of the outlying parishes?" And I said, "Sure." Just hopped in my car with a rain jacket and drove out there. And by the press conference wrapped up, they said, "Go check out some flood preparations." And the next thing I knew, every single road in and out of the parish was underwater, and I was stuck there for the next 3 days. I luckily, I had just gotten back from a camping trip, so I had some stuff in the car, but I ended up, sleeping in the back of the car without, the kind of the gear I would have liked to have brought with me.
Right.
But what worked for me, I think, particularly well is hooking up with the national. I managed to hook up with the National Guard, and they're, if you can get in with some units, they're a great way to even just get a ride to shelters. I went with them delivering water to shelters, which was a great way to find different people in different areas of the parish who were had evacuated.
And did you just flag them down the side of the road, or did you go through the communications office or the National Guard headquarters?
Both. So I started off, I ended up stuck at the courthouse, which happened to be where the National Guard started staging out of. So I got in with them a little bit that way, but then I would also, one of them would drop me off at a shelter, and I'd beg the units coming through, and sometimes their captains or majors were friendly and let me hop on, and sometimes they said no way, and you were sort of stuck there until the next one came along. One of the things that made and I imagine this would happen in a number of hurricanes as well, one of the things that made filing difficult is the cell phone networks.
Right.
Went down, I think, in the second day of the flood. Which, I was cut off. I couldn't get into the newsroom. I couldn't make phone calls, couldn't email. Made it difficult to file. And I was able to beg my way for a little computer time at an unused terminal in the 911 dispatch room. But for that, I would have been really kind of out of luck out there.
Right. I mean, on the cell phone, I covered Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and I was going around with there were three of us in the car. Luckily, each of us had a different cell phone network. So when the AT&T network, the AT&T network worked in parts of the city but not others. Verizon worked in parts of the city, not others, and I guess it was T-Mobile worked elsewhere. Usually we were able, after the first couple of days you couldn't really get through anyway. But after that, at least part of it was open somewhere. And so we'd be going down the highway talking to an editor, and all of a sudden the AT&T signal would die, and so we just pick them up and call them on the T-Mobile signal. But yeah, you have to plan ahead for how you're actually going to transmit your story.
Right.
You have to write it on paper and pencil, so it doesn't get flooded out. But how are you going to get the images back or the stories back?
That's right.
And bring Ziploc bags for your phone and for your notebooks.
Absolutely, Ziploc bags. Bryn also makes a really good point about the National Guard. You can spend, weeks ahead of the storm asking the flak office for, an embed, and you can make all sorts of arrangements for that. And jumping on an APC in the middle of the street is really a much more efficient way to an armored personnel carrier that they bring into the city to get through, tanks that are able to go through the high water. And that's a much more efficient way of getting an embed, is just being friendly and jumping on the back of their vehicles than trying to work through the PR office, which is, worried about details like that the guys on the ground aren't. So be intrepid.
All right. And Bryn, I wanted to ask you a little bit about one of the stories you did about the Cajun Navy, which actually showed up again in the news with Hurricane Harvey last couple of weeks. Tell me about that. I mean, what is the Cajun Navy, and how'd you come across those guys, and what did you write about them?
Oh, well, it was hard to miss them. I mean, you couldn't not come across them in Louisiana. And it's not, I don't think, a Louisiana-specific thing. It's a group of boaters who own their own shallow draft, flat bottom boats who see flooding and they get out there and start rescuing people. But South Louisiana in particular has a very deep tradition of fishing and duck hunting, and you have a lot of crawfish fishermen, sport fishermen who have fan boats or flat bottom john boats or whatever, and are very good at handling them in swamps, which are conditions that are very similar to a flooded street with unpredictable currents and hidden obstacles and that kind of stuff. And so they, I guess, first came to prominence after Hurricane Katrina, when they defied evacuation orders and drove past roadblocks to get into New Orleans to help rescues, and then really organized themselves again in the Baton Rouge floods to do a lot of rescues. And then I think South Louisianans have a huge amount of pride, probably similar to the way Floridians feel about having survived a lot of natural disasters and having learned a lot of lessons the hard way. And so when Harvey was headed towards southwest Louisiana and East Texas, a lot of people in South Louisiana said, okay, we can help. There's things that we know and we can do. And so you had huge caravans of people loading up their boats on trailers, packing water and jambalaya and red beans and rice and all that kind of stuff, and heading for the border as fast as they could.
Right. Okay. Now, Wendy, you also, when we were talking before this, you said, you tell your reporters, always be ready for the completely unexpected story. I mean, give me an example of that. And,
okay. Well, we had a reporter, one of the other things is, the Bryn said is all news organizations have a hurricane plan, and pretty much the day after the hurricane comes, you throw out the plan because the hurricane didn't happen that way. And I mean, you have people in the right places. You try to pre-position people in the right places, and then you realize that the storm didn't go that way and you have to move them. But in terms of looking for the unexpected, I have an example of Hurricane Rita. I had a reporter who was just wandering around East Texas looking for people to interview and recovery stories to find and things like that. And he went into a church thinking that would be a good place to find, refugees and the pastor who could talk about, what he was doing to shepherd his flock. And sitting up on the pulpit was a lioness. I mean, a big, full-size honkin' lion from Africa. And it was just sitting there, out of the water. And we ended up with this really great story about the lion who escaped from one of these unlicensed zoos that are in East Texas and West Louisiana, where people just seem to collect wildlife. And the lioness had escaped during the storm and looked for refuge and found this lovely little church and ended up there. So we ended up with a great multimedia piece about the lion in East Texas. So that that's a really good story. Obviously, the human stories in Harvey, the Washington Post had a fabulous story about a bakery that I used to frequent when I lived down there for Mexican pastries. And some of the bakers were stuck in the bakery during the storm, and they had all these ingredients that were going to go bad, so they baked millions of pieces of bread and then gave them away. And another post-Katrina story, which I still remember because the story was so evocative. We had an entire story about someone who came back to Katrina a month after the storm or so and opened their refrigerator, which had been off in the South Louisiana heat for a month. Right. And that was I can still smell the refrigerator without having ever been anywhere near it. So
Right.
look for those and write them, because those are the good stories that nobody else will have.
Okay. So I want to remind our viewers that if you want to send us questions, send questions to any of these three, send them to @NatPress or submit via Facebook, and I'll work those into the conversation. But let's turn a little bit to what happens after the storm passes. I mean, once the immediate danger is gone and the waters have pulled back, I mean, what are those like short-term cleanup stories that you need to start looking for? I mean, what were those stories in Baton Rouge last year?
Well, so immediately people try to rush in and muck out their homes, and I think so we would do just a lot of just simple explainers, like what's the best way to disinfect your home, prevent mold growth, and just driving neighborhoods that had flooded over and over and over again, and watching the debris piles add up, and talking to people and saying, what's the biggest problem you're facing? How are things moving together? And you have a lot of great stories about all sorts of people showing up to help their friends rip out all the drywall, what they're throwing away, what they're trying to save, what they probably can't save, and what somehow survived are always good stories. And then there's a lot of stories about that I got to in the week or two after the flood about people's experiences during it. So I interviewed a bunch of emergency first responders, so cops, sheriff's deputies, firemen, EMTs, who had lost their homes and evacuated themselves, but then had to keep working pretty much 24 hours a day to rescue other people. And what that experience was like, and some of the lengths they went through just to get to work. Foster children, the state agencies that are responsible for foster children have to somehow track them and figure out where they've gone, where they've been evacuated to. And that was a catastrophe after Katrina. There was like a huge problem with trying to track them, and they did a much better time after the Baton Rouge flood. But that was a crisis for those caseworkers and social workers at the state agencies. And then there's a lot to be said about just housing. I mean, there's going to be people for example, in the Houston area or in the Beaumont area that are living in shelters for weeks. And how long do those shelters stay open? There's going to be people living in tents in their yard. There's going to be people in RVs, and there's going to be people who are living on mattresses in the middle of a mold-infested, disgusting home. And trying to find a hotel room or trying to find somewhere safe to live can be very difficult. And there's a lot of stories to be written about that.
Okay, and what was going on with your colleagues at the Advocate Papers? The Advocate Papers are in Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and Acadiana. How many of the staff members, your colleagues, were personally affected, personally flooded out, and were they still writing stories about other people who were flooded out while they were flooded out?
Yes. Of our Baton Rouge newsrooms, we've got bureaus, and a large bureau in New Orleans as well, but of our Baton Rouge newsroom, I think about a third lost their homes. And
wow.
They pretty much all kept working. And then we started pretty quickly organizing company-wide muck teams to go to their homes on the weekends and clean them out and then keep working.
Okay. All right. Now let me ask you one other question about Baton Rouge, and we'll kind of turn to that.
Sure.
Kind of what comes after, what comes next. You just recently did a story quantifying exactly how much damage actually occurred because of the floods. But it wasn't such an easy thing to actually track down. Can you maybe talk about that story and what sort of sources and resources did you use to try to quantify it?
I found that actually really surprising personally, and maybe that this is sort of old hand to people who've covered a number of disasters, but getting reliable numbers on just what happened is actually really difficult. Most data is sort of expensive to collect, and government agencies or private groups only collect it if they have a reason to collect it. And it turns out that nobody has a use for a comprehensive census of how many people evacuated, who's where, whose homes flooded, how many businesses closed. So you can get the number of people who've applied for FEMA assistance, but there's a lot of noise in that number. So it could be people whose neighborhood they were forced to evacuate. They don't know yet if they flooded. Turned out they didn't. You can get multiple people in the same house who both file an application. You can all sorts of stuff in there. Eventually, FEMA will verify losses, so you can get a hard number of the number of people who FEMA verified flooding damage to their home. But you have people who may not have qualified who did have legit damage. A huge problem we saw in New Orleans, and it's a little harder to quantify in Baton Rouge, was especially in poorer neighborhoods, where you've had sort of informal inheritance, where people have passed down homes for years, but they've never formalized the deed. You don't have a formal title, or your deed was destroyed and you don't have the paperwork. Well, you need that paperwork to prove ownership to FEMA to qualify. And so we also then, it took us probably about a good year before we felt pretty confident in our homeowner numbers. I also was able to cross-reference with the assessor's offices, who they do a reassessment after the flood, and they can give you a pretty good count on how many homes were flood damaged. But they can't quantify how much money was lost. And then the areas that you get the best numbers for, government property, they can tell you exactly how much they've lost. Nonprofits is a little more tricky because churches aren't eligible for government aid for the most part.
Okay.
So there's no numbers there. In businesses, there's very little data available. SBA runs loans for businesses, but there's a lot of reasons that businesses wouldn't want to necessarily apply for those loans. And so nobody else is really out there tracking that. Some chambers of commerce can give you maybe an estimate, but nobody's can give you a definitive sense of the business losses.
Okay. All right. So there's a lot of money washing around there, and trying to track it is a big part of the ongoing stories. I wanted to turn to you, Jonathan, because this is kind of when the story turns to Washington. So Superstorm Sandy was in 2012, and that's when the big aid packages, or relief packages, were passed, and so you're still covering that 5 years down the road. So could you maybe just first of all tell me about the congressional process for providing the relief or recovery aid? How much of that is kind of existing money coming from FEMA or HUD or Small Business Administration? How much of that is new money? And what kind of tips would you have for how to cover what will be a political discussion or fight about how much money should go for Harvey, how much money should go to South Florida after Hurricane Irma, if Hurricane Irma hits the way it looks like?
Well, there is existing money. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has a budget. This is the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah.
So some of that money is running out now. Small Business Administration makes loans. There are existing groups, existing programs. The Community Development Block Grant Program, for example, can help. But then that money is not expected to last for a big storm, and that's where you need supplemental money. In 2012, the FEMA money, or the Sandy money, got caught up in a fight with certain Republican lawmakers from the South who decided that they were going to make a stand against government spending. Mick Mulvaney, now the Office of Management and Budget Director, demanded it be offset with cuts elsewhere in the federal budget. Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, railed about how it was all pork that wasn't related to Sandy, that fact checkers said was not true. And frankly, in 2012, they couldn't pass legislation. It had to wait till 2013 and finally passed. Among those voting no on the bill was Paul Ryan, now the House Speaker. And this time, everybody rushed to pass money to help Harvey victims. They needed the money. You can see that the huge damages. The irony of it is the person who sponsored the Sandy bill in 2012 was Rodney Frelinghuysen, now the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. His name was on the bill to bail out Hurricane Harvey.
Okay, so what did they pass? They passed something this week for Harvey, right?
Right, about $17 billion. It's going to be a down payment. Mm-hmm. The House passed something very quickly, and the Senate came back with a larger bill, which also had some other maneuvers in there, including the debt limit and other issues that unrelated to the hurricane. And that supposedly, as we're speaking, was passing the House today.
Okay, what was the final number for Sandy after 12?
The Sandy wound up being about $50 billion in two shifts. There's an emergency money that passed in 2012, and then the big money came again in 2013.
Okay. How do they come up with these numbers? I remember in just a day or two after Hurricane Katrina, the Louisiana senator at the time was already saying we need $250 billion. She obviously plucked that out of thin air, but how do they start to approximate what the damage is going to be and how much they can reasonably get from Congress?
Well, you can see in terms of the damages. Downtown Houston, which is inundated, you can see that, billions of dollars worth of businesses and homes that were destroyed. You may not know the exact number. Remember, you're allocating money, but it still has to be given out. So you can authorize the spending of $1 zillion, but when they apply for grants and they apply for loans, you're handing out the money. That's how much you know it is. But you want to have a bank account that you can draw against. And I'm a lawmaker. It's in my interest to ask for as much as I can because you don't want to be caught short. You may not spend all that money, but you don't want to have your checkbook, with a deficit at the end of the day.
Right. Well, so and this kind of goes question to any of you. I mean, what are the roles of the federal agencies? We've talked about FEMA, Housing and Urban Development, HUD, Small Business Administration. I mean, are those the main pots of federal money, and are there other pots, and why is the SBA in there? That's one that I don't really understand.
Well, I mean, FEMA has a large pot of money. The number of programs to reimburse local governments for costs related to disaster response. They can give emergency grant money to individuals who lost their homes, either renters that were flooded out or homeowners. But there's relatively low caps on the amount of money that they can give out under those programs. SBA also has an emergency loan program for homeowners. And there's some very particular issues that have driven a lot of people in Louisiana insane with the SBA program. I don't know if you want to get into that now.
Yeah, I mean, tell us. I mean, yes, anytime you're driving somebody insane, it's a good story.
So there's federal rules under the Stafford Act, which kind of controls disaster response, that you can't duplicate benefits, and it's meant so that when you have emergency money, it gets spread around, and that people don't get more than they're sort of entitled to. But under the current interpretation of those rules, if you apply for an SBA emergency loan, no matter whether or not you actually take out any SBA money from that loan, that is considered the full amount you're approved for is considered a benefit from the federal government. So then when they come back and they have disaster recovery grant money available in subsequent programs, that is counted. You have to subtract the amount of loan money for which you were approved.
Okay.
Which has frustrated a lot of people because FEMA aggressively encouraged them to apply for SBA loans, and now they're kind of out of luck when the more generous grant program set up through subsequent supplemental appropriations comes through.
That's happened with Sandy also, and lawmakers have tried to do something about that because they said, take out this loan, and then all of a sudden now FEMA's offering them grants and say, wait a second, you can't get it, you're ineligible, you took out this loan. He said, I wouldn't have known that. I wouldn't have taken out the loan if I knew they could get the grant money.
Okay, and when, like for Harvey, which I guess happened 2 weeks ago, Harvey?
2 weeks ago,
I mean, will those grants and those SBA loans, when will those start to kick in? I mean, in
sort of
first couple of weeks or right away or what?
Sort of in two phases, and this is this is sort of a longer term issue that a number of people have raised as a problem in the way that we respond to disasters. Is that so? FEMA and SBA have sort of these permanent disaster immediate response programs, which they're probably right now going through shelters in East Texas, getting all sorts of people to register and beginning to make their assessments to get out those grants. But any kind of longer term recovery program after Katrina, after Sandy, after the Baton Rouge floods, after Harvey, is usually going to be supplemental congressional appropriations, billions of dollars from Congress, funneled through HUD in their Community Development Block Grant Program. And there's no permanent program to do that, and there's no formula to do that. That's Congress decides each time how much each place gets. So you're sort of per person flooded. Dollar amounts vary from disaster to disaster. It can become sort of how influential is your congressional delegation, or how wide, Harvey.
What kind of paybacks are happening from the last storm?
Right,
Yeah.
and how many people sort of feel that, how many other delegations just got hit with a disaster and so feel like they have to vote for you. If you get hit by multiple states, that can be politically advantageous. And then it's up to your state to devise a different program under a certain number of guidelines. And so that won't happen for some time. And you won't know what those kind of grant programs will look like. And I think that's part of why they're aggressively encouraging you to apply for SBA loans, because the grant programs don't exist yet.
Okay.
And
they may exist later, or they may or may not exist later.
Correct. And so, Louisiana ultimately has gotten so far for the 2016 floods about $1.9 billion in congressional allocations. The state believes that we still need much more to recover. The House, just earlier this week, passed $7.9 billion, but that was just for FEMA for Harvey. The Senate version added in $7.4 billion in Community Development Block Grant money, so supplemental appropriation for 2017 disasters. But I assume they will be coming back again to try to get more money to set up some sort of Texas run or Louisiana run or Florida run disaster recovery programs for the longer term.
Okay. So you both mentioned the kind of the controversial nature of a lot of these spending packages that are going through Congress, and that came up just the last couple of weeks with Senator Cruz of Texas, who had criticized the Sandy relief bill as filled with unrelated pork. You've been covering the Sandy relief bill and the aftermath of it. I mean, you mentioned the Washington Post fact checker. So, how do you as a reporter, take on a statement like that? The bill was filled with unrelated pork. How do you quantify that? And did you write about Cruz's statements this last week?
I didn't write about Cruz's statement. I actually took a vacation week, which I
Okay.
rarely have. I followed it from afar, and what made it easy for us is Governor Christie used that and really ran after Cruz. And as you know, Governor Christie does not use diplomatic language. So that became a really good story for us generally. But the issue becomes, was it unrelated pork? So you look at the bill, and you talk to lawmakers, and you saw in the Sandy bill, there was money that wasn't directly related to Sandy repairs, but it was to prevent the future from happening. In fact, legislation now for the National Flood Insurance Program, which we talked about at one point, would offer low interest loans to homeowners when they rebuild, to rebuild a little higher, to build a flood wall, so they don't have to keep paying out the same money over and over again. Is that unrelated pork? Well, I would argue, from a taxpayer standpoint, no, because why should I keep bailing out the same homeowners for the same damages when a little bit of money would prevent me from having to pay all that damages? And also, a lot of it is, and you have a group of lawmakers who just hate government spending, and this was a chance to make a stand, and nobody in Texas is going to vote against you because you wouldn't help people in New York.
Right.
So it's a winning argument politically, and they, for the New York residents and the New Jersey residents, unfortunately, they were made the political scapegoat for other people to make a political point.
Okay, and I do want to, you mentioned the Washington Post fact checker again, Glenn Kessler, who awarded Senator Cruz 3 Pinocchios for what he said was a, quote, wildly incorrect claim that the bill was filled with unrelated pork. He said it was, quote, largely aimed at dealing with Sandy along with relatively minor items to address other or future disasters. So, he gave him 3 out of 4 Pinocchios.
But remember, one person's pork is another person's project of national significance.
Right. So, the other thing I want to get into is, pork aside, how do you actually track this money? You've done quite a few stories in the last couple of years about FEMA spending, whether it was spent appropriately or efficiently. What sort of stories have you written, and how do you actually what are the tips you have for reporters for staying on top of the spend of the money?
Well, after the disaster, the quick thing is to get the money out. Get it out, write the checks, help people, and then you have to go back and make sure the money was handed out properly. Each agency has an inspector general, which is a watchdog that oversees the spending of that agency, and the HUD Inspector General, Housing and Urban Development, and the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General, because FEMA is under DHS, have done several audits of the money after the fact. And that's a lot of the stories that I worked on. I got on the mailing lists of the Inspector Generals of both agencies, and as they issue a report, I get a copy of the report, and when it says New Jersey on it, I then read it and write about it. And when it said Texas, when it says Louisiana, I delete it. And so you had issues where FEMA, for example, gave $250 million out to homeowners who had also filed for private insurance and were double dipping. There's a database of private claims. FEMA never bothered to do that. The state of New Jersey was asked to repay money because they gave money to people that didn't qualify under a program. In fact, their argument was, well, they almost qualified, and besides, it accomplished the purpose that was needed to help these people get back on their feet, so it should be okay. That FEMA got really taken over the coals for not regulating the private companies. You know, when we talk about these floods, FEMA itself doesn't pay out the claims per se. They have private insurance companies that check the houses and then are paid by the government to administer the program. What happened with Sandy, and this one came out from members of Congress, that you had a house that was destroyed by Sandy, and the insurance company came over and they said, oh no, there was a crack before that, and it was earth movement, it had nothing to do with the flood, and a lot of people didn't get the money they were supposed to get in insurance. Turned out, finally, at the argument of several lawmakers in the Jersey delegation, the New York delegation, including Bob Menendez from New Jersey, and Chuck Schumer, who is now the number one Senate Democrat, FEMA agreed to reopen the claims, and for New Jersey alone, they paid out. This is after they already made the ruling, more than $350 million additionally in damages to the members. The other people to talk to also, which I discovered, was the trial lawyers. A lot of these companies hire, and after every disaster, and they're vilified, the trial lawyers are vilified, and they're called ambulance chasers. No, a lot of them, they get clients, and they really know what's happening. They have power of the courts and discovery, when you have testify under oath, and they can really find out what's happening. I found out after accidents, after crashes, they really have a lot of information. I've talked to a few of them. Big firms have like a lot of these clients, and they tell you what's going on because they've talked to the people.
Is there a particular? I mean, do they have their own? I mean, the lawyers who handle disaster claims, they have their own association or any way to tap into them?
Well, there's the American Association for Justice, which is the trial lawyers trade group.
Okay.
And then there's also certain firms that, having covered a lot of this, to go to. They're a go-to places. One, I know Transportation has a former Inspector General of the Department of Transportation, so that firm gets a call on transportation issues. In this case, there was one firm that had a lot of the clients of the Sandy victims, and once you read that this person has it, everybody goes to them. And I've been talking to him and his firm from time to time on that issue.
One thing is that trial lawyers will often come to the reporters too. You don't
Really?
always
Okay.
have to wait if they want publicity for their case. But just to build on something John said that I think is a really interesting point, is that the agencies do more than just give out money, right? I mean, after Katrina, FEMA was raked over the coals for separating families on those infamous FEMA flights and sending people, you know, grandma with the kids to New York and the rest of the family to Utah, and then they would not tell the families unless they had the social security number of the people where their family was. And I defy anyone at this table to have memorized their nephew's social security number. So how do you, the families were in a terrible state afterwards, and that was a terrific story. I mean, I think FEMA has improved tremendously, I think, since Katrina, but that was a big lesson. And then things like at the state level, the Texas Workforce Commission spent more than a year finding jobs for Katrina refugees or helping them find jobs. And I remember we were doing a year out piece in 2006. And when I say we, I'm sorry, I'm referring to the Associated Press, where I was with when we did all these stories. There were a few people who either didn't want jobs or couldn't find jobs, and that a year later they were just sort of giving up this project of finding jobs for Katrina refugees. So there was a lot of agencies that are doing more than just money things that you have to watch their behavior too.
And also, that's where your local lawmaker comes into play. They want the publicity, but also they're supposedly in there to help the public, to help their constituents. So in a case of that case where people are not finding out where their loved ones are being sent to, they'll complain to their congressman, they'll complain to their senator.
Exactly.
Right.
And that senator will talk to you, and the senator will make the phone call and probably get that information. I mean, the whole thing with the Sandy claims, that people complained to their local lawmakers, and they took the lead, they demanded, and especially senators and members of Congress, they're appropriating the money, they can demand meetings. And it was such a meeting, Bob Menendez and the New York, Jersey senators and lawmakers and the members of the House and the New York people sat down with the head of FEMA and said, you fix this. And FEMA has no choice but to fix it.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned the people heading out of town, the diaspora from New Orleans. I mean, you oversaw the coverage of that for a while. So just
year.
describe what was going on after Katrina. How many people were leaving the city? Then how did you actually structure coverage of the people who ended up in Atlanta and Houston and Utah and Iowa and wherever else?
Well, I mean, the VAP had an advantage in that case in that we had reporters already in all those cities. I think a newspaper would have to deploy people to the cities where those happened. But we set up a structure of reporters who were all assigned to cover this. I mean, the Houston Bureau did a tremendous amount of the work because 250,000 of them, were in a convoy straight out I-10 as soon as it was clear from New Orleans to Houston. And in fact, I was running the coverage in Baton Rouge and saw this convoy and got in my rented pickup truck and drove back to Houston to get there when they were there. And Houston was sort of a nexus where these refugees would come together and they would get health care, which was denied them in the Superdome. They would get food and water that was denied them in the Superdome. And going back to the health of the reporters, we started calling it Astrodomitis because all the reporters were who were in the Astrodome with these people who had spent a week in the Superdome under horrible conditions. We're all sick. They all had respiratory illnesses. They all had, they were spreading a flu around the Superdome like wildfire, and then they're put in the Astrodome where they are getting antibiotics and they are getting medical care and water and food, and they're getting better, but those germs are still there, and all the reporters were coming down with Astrodomitis. But then they were sent, then it was a matter of somebody either in Washington or on the hurricane scene keeping in touch with FEMA to find out where did you send these people. And they literally would just take people online and put them in different lines, and they would end up on planes and they wouldn't tell them where they were going. And so you would land in Salt Lake City. Now picture some of these residents of the Ninth Ward in Louisiana who have never been outside of the Ninth Ward, let alone, worldly people. And now they're in Salt Lake City and they have no idea what they're doing. And so, there was a lot of coverage of people, the good people of the United States who would meet the FEMA planes and say, you can come stay with me for a week, or you can come stay here, or here's a place to stay. And they would sort of help people get back on their feet. And that was a great story to cover.
Okay. So one thing we also need to talk about is the flood insurance and the National Flood Insurance Program. A couple of big questions. First of all, why don't more people have flood insurance? I mean, some of the numbers that I've seen, I guess from Baton Rouge, it was 20% or so?
About
or
30.
30%, and from Houston, right, in the last week, it's 17% had flood insurance. So why don't more people have flood insurance? And would somebody just explain to me the National Flood Insurance Program and what's going on? It needs to be reauthorized, is that right?
It expires in the end of September. Most federal programs have to be reauthorized every few years. And in this case, there's legislation, there's a discussion whether you should privatize flood insurance. Of course, flood insurance became a federal responsibility because private insurers were going to take a bath. I mean, would you like to be an insurance company in Houston today?
Right.
So the federal government took over. But because of Katrina, especially because of the other storms, the premiums never paid for the entire cost of providing that insurance and paying damages. So it's billions of dollars in debt. The question is, do you ever going to get that debt paid? Much do you raise the premiums? The flood maps are out of date. The president's budget prohibits spending to update the flood maps. So there are places now, certainly with climate change, certainly with new development, that there are areas that would not or considered eligible for flood insurance that clearly are now. And so those folks wouldn't get flood insurance because they didn't know they were in a flood zone. And now they learned they were in a flood zone the hard way.
Right.
And the question is, what do you do? There are various bills in Congress. One would require you to pay a lot more. One would, the Bob Menendez bill that I referred to earlier, included low interest money that under the plan that you could rebuild your house to make it more flood proof, so you wouldn't have to pay the damages. They would limit, some of it would limit how much the increase would be. And they're still discussing, again, some of it is it's federal spending. You have billions of dollars in debt. Do you want the people with flood insurance to pay that debt off, or are you just going to carry it on the books or forgive it? And that goes to the whole issue of what are you spending federal money on, deficit spending, everything else.
And the very simple answer is it's expensive. I mean,
Right.
I lived in Houston for 20 years, and we had homeowners insurance, and we had flood insurance, and we had supplemental flood insurance. And when it happened, we did eventually get repaid, but that's expensive. And you're asking a lot. I mean, there are people who can barely afford their own homeowners insurance, let alone flood insurance and supplemental flood insurance and all of this. And it's a big bite out of a family budget. Some people feel they'll just rebuild, they'll just, because they're not, and people live in simple homes, or they feel like they're tenants and so they don't need flood insurance.
Right.
But it's, it's, I was saying earlier, it's like being sick and getting health insurance. If you live in a city that's going to flood, the insurance is going to be very expensive for that.
Right. I mean, is that what you found in Baton Rouge last year?
Well, yes. So I would say sort of there's two sort of main reasons. I mean, it's if you live in what's considered a special flood hazard zone, flood insurance is very expensive. But if you have a federally backed mortgage, it's required while you have the mortgage. I found that a lot of people that I interviewed, very sad. They had just paid off their mortgage, so they just dropped their flood insurance because it was several thousand. I mean, it's quite expensive, several $1,000s a year often. Or you don't
several $1,000s a year
in premiums,
Wow.
just for flood insurance coverage. And you live in a house where you bought it from someone who was there for 20 years. You've been there for 10 years. It hasn't flooded in that time period. So you think, oh, well, I mean, can save that money. We'll be okay. Or you don't live in a special flood hazard zone according to FEMA's flood maps, which, as you mentioned, are not always the best predictors of risk, actually. And anecdotally, at least, it seems that realtors and bankers will frequently tell people, you're not in a flood zone, you don't need flood insurance.
Right.
Which is actually a terrible message in some ways, because if you don't live in the special flood hazard zones, your premiums are very low, relatively speaking, and you don't know, like as you're seeing in Houston, as we saw in Baton Rouge, I think roughly half of the people who flooded in Baton Rouge don't live in the FEMA special flood hazard zones.
Right.
The maps are really bad predictors of risk. And FEMA's response to that, at least so far, has been, we've asked, like, are you going to update the flood maps? And they've said, no, that kind of a rainstorm is so unprecedented that it shouldn't affect our overall calculation of risk. Well,
so they're saying
frankly,
their maps weren't bad, it's just the storm was so unusually bad.
Right.
Okay.
But, we've seen over and over again that we get unusually bad, unprecedented floods.
Right.
And so it's saying that you're in a 100-year flood zone versus a 500-year flood zone, what does that actually mean? Do they have enough data or baseline observations to actually make that kind of assessment of risk? And when was the last time they even updated those flood maps? Because one of the things we saw in Baton Rouge is there had been so much wetlands development and development in the floodplains and construction of levees that completely changes the water flow, and you have areas that hadn't in 20 or 30 years updated their flood maps, so it doesn't really tell you anything actually.
Okay. So I wanted to touch briefly on another kind of recovery and rebuilding angle that was down in Louisiana. After Katrina, it was called the Road Home Program, which was kind of to help people rebuild their homes. And after the floods, it's called the Restore Louisiana Program. Could you give me a little sense of where does that money come from and how well has that been working?
So those are both programs set up with the special congressional appropriations to HUD under community development block grants. And the two programs are differed in some significant ways. But those are the kind of programs in New Jersey and New York had similar recovery programs after Sandy, where they get billions of dollars from the federal government and then to devise a recovery program. Going back to flood insurance, I think one of the frustrations you run into is that every time there's a big enough disaster, there is this huge pot of federal money, and usually people end up getting, in some ways, in some sense, penalized for having flood insurance coverage because they usually deduct what you've received from flood insurance before considering how much grant money you get. And understandably, some people who've been paying high flood insurance premiums for years get frustrated that the neighbor down the street who never paid into the flood insurance program gets more grant money. But I don't really, that's a tricky solution to that. One of the big issues with Road Home, and I think something to watch when you're looking at how they structure these programs, was what the formula is and how they decide who gets what kind of money. And one big criticism of Road Home was that they used the assessed value of your home to calculate how much grant money you received, and not the estimated repair cost, which ended up having a disproportionately bad impact on low-income people, on minorities, because their homes tended to were concentrated in neighborhoods that had lower assessed values. So you could have identical homes in a wealthy white neighborhood and a poorer black neighborhood, which would cost the exact same amount of money to repair, but one's assessed at twice the value, so that those people are going to get twice the grant money. The Restore Louisiana program is using using the opposite. They're basing it on estimated repair costs, but sort of how they structure it, and like what kind of with the Restore Louisiana, because the state feels that we have not gotten sufficient money to pay everything, they've structured it into sort of a 6 or 7 tiers. So the first people that get grant money are going to be low-income people who had no flood insurance.
Okay.
And elderly people who had no flood insurance. The next group of people are going, and then they'll slowly open up the program to more and more people.
Okay. All right. So I want to. We just have a few more minutes. I'm going to, when this program's done, we're going to list online several resources for journalists who are covering these issues. I'll point out a couple. The Congressional Research Service has several backgrounders on FEMA disaster declarations, how they're developed, and so forth, on disaster housing, on infrastructure repair, and a range of other policy issues. And we'll have a link to get access to all of those Congressional Research Service backgrounders. If you want to see how New Orleans is recovering after Katrina, which is one of the longest, a very long recovery after a storm, there's an organization called the Data Research Center down in New Orleans. It came from the Brookings Institution, which was monitoring Katrina for the first 5 years, and then it handed off to the Data Research Center. They're still tracking progress in New Orleans, and so it's a good way to kind of see how long recovery can take, and you can see how neighborhoods are coming back and how quickly some come back versus others.
And they have a lot of great information about sort of the way that policy decisions have shaped what areas do and don't come back. And
okay, so it's a good kind of a model to look at. So if for the folks in Houston who are covering what's going on, here's what happened in New Orleans, and here's at least some sort of a roadmap to look at. And depending on what happens in Miami this weekend, they could be facing the same thing. In the last couple of minutes, Jonathan or the others, do you have any specific tips or resources that reporters can look for?
Well, again, I think the Inspector General's reports would be a great source of information. HUD certainly, FEMA, the Small Business Administration, they're available on, the Inspector General has websites, and it's all available there. There's a clearinghouse called ignet.com, and that lists all the Inspector Generals, and you can look up the agencies. And local members of Congress, they're getting the reports, they're requesting the reports, and just calls to their offices and to say, press people, say, hey, do you have information? Can you help me with this? And they're also pretty good resources.
Okay. Bryn, any final resource or tip that you would pass on?
Well, I would watch the oversight committees in Congress as well.
Okay.
FEMA tends to be a favorite whipping boy of a lot of people in Congress, because they're handling massive catastrophes, and they tend to, I don't know if it's an impossible job, but they tend to screw a lot of things up. And the oversight committees dig into this. We found, when Nunes was the chair of the oversight committee, had brought up a number of issues that had happened in Baton Rouge that appeared that FEMA had dropped the ball on. So just tracking some of that can be very helpful to turn up some missed opportunities and screw-ups as well. Okay.
And Wendy, last question, a final resource or tip that you would pass on to reporters who are facing these stories?
I think in addition to these agencies that the guys here mentioned, I think the local governments have a lot of data that can be down to the block level that would be very helpful. And homeowners associations and things like that might be keeping track of things as well.
Okay. So. Well, I think that's all the time we have for now. I want to thank all three of you. And I'm sure we'll be kind of watching the aftermath of last month's storm and this month's storm for quite a while.
I think we will.
And I want to thank you for joining us today from the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation, where we make good journalists better. Today we've heard from 3 journalists about how to cover hurricanes and floods, both during the storm and after. Find more webinars and reporting resources at nationalpress.org and follow us on Twitter @NatPress.